This is the lecture for week 3 of RLST 010, an introduction to the Bible. We are talking today about the prophets and also have a brief chapter on the Apocrypha to finish off our Old Testament section. Um, first, is the introduction on the prophets. It's a bit tricky to talk about prophets because sometimes their original voice may have been edited in the versions that we have, so that almost they say the opposite of what the original prophet intended. Jeremiah is a key example, for instance, which you have almost competing voices within the same prophetic text. We do have some examples of prophets from around the ancient Near East. They seem to speak for kings. They often have a guild with set titles and hierarchies. But this kind of information actually seems to show how the prophets of Judah and Israel are quite different. They seem, compared to these other prophets, Near Eastern prophets, they seem unorganized. They don't seem to have formal titles or hierarchies. They seem to sometimes compete with each other, and they speak to the people as much as they speak to the kings. Now, the canonical order has a lot to do with the length of the books. It's not chronological or historical. Um, but we will follow the canonical order, roughly the Christian canonical order in this, uh, in this series, in this textbook. The history is clustered when we think about the actual history. When the prophets um, prophesied, we'll think about three different periods. One is the period of Assyrian dominance, that's first, around the 8th century. Then there's the period of the Babylonian dominance, a little bit later, about the 7th century. And then the Persian dominance, maybe around the 5th century, 6th, 5th century. So the first cluster of prophets we have is Amos, Hosea in the northern kingdom of Israel, and Isaiah and Micah from the southern kingdom of Judah. They're all focused on the Assyrian threat in time, right? This is the first time group. The second cluster is Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk, and also early Jeremiah with the fall of Assyria and the rise of the Babylonian period. And then, Obadiah, Ezekiel, and Second Isaiah are all during this period of exile as well. They're Second Isaiah, we'll get into it, but um, you will explain later, but parts of the book of Isaiah we could say for now. And then lastly, the third group, Haggai, Zechariah, third Isaiah, so to speak, like second Isaiah, we'll talk about it more, parts of it. Joel, Malachi, Jonah are all in the post-exilic period after the exile has ended, and some have returned to Israel, the land of Israel, the land of Palestine, and it's the Persian period. As far as what they're saying, we have kind of these oracles of doom. That's common. There's also oracles of salvation. There are woes where they bring in condemnation or promises of suffering or predictions. And also there are wisdom speakings, narratives, right, stories of their actions, and even calls to prophesy. That's a pretty common kind of writing that exists among the prophets. Is how did they become a prophet? What was their call to prophecy, to the prophetic office? So with that, we can jump in to our first prophet, which is Isaiah. Isaiah is very theologically rich and can be divided into three major sections, right? Condemnation, and the condemnation was of both social injustice and religious idolatry or apostasy. So uh, uh, the poor treatment of the oppressed among you, right, in a social scale, see, on a horizontal level, we could say, and then in the vertical schema, betraying God, worshiping other gods, or not in the way that God has commanded or prefers, right? So religious betrayal and then betrayal of fellow fellow members of Israel, of the Jewish people. Then so the first section is this kind of condemnation. Second section, we have consolation and restoration. And then a third and final section, critiques of continued failures even after Israel's restoration. All right, so these are the three major sections of Isaiah. And Isaiah, because it's so theologically rich, is also very popular with the New Testament authors. It gets quoted more than any other book in the Hebrew Bible, right? So it's split into these three sections. The first Isaiah, it takes place in chapters 1 through 39, and this is reflecting the Assyrian period, right? So scholars have often seen Isaiah as being written in at least three major sections because it seems to reflect three different kind of perspectives, three different situations of the Jewish people. The first is clearly the threat of Assyria, right, and being taken to exile. The second, the late exilic period under Babylon. So when they're already, this is about chapters 40 to 55, when the Jews are already in captivity. The kingdom of Judah, southern kingdom now, has been taken off into Babylon. And then thirdly, Judah under the Persians. That's chapters 56 through 66. So that would be the latest period, the latest last part of Isaiah, and also the latest period when many Jews have returned to the old kingdom of Judah under the Persian rule and command. So we'll touch each of these in turn. So first, Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, introduces really all the major themes that will be touched on in Isaiah, condemning the Israelites because of their idolatry and their oppression, promising restoration for those who repent, and this kind of coming hope of a glorious future on Zion. Zion is the temple. We'll be hearing this phrase a lot. It is the mountain where the temple is built. It is the mountain. It's said to be, David's hill and mountain in the city of David, Jerusalem. So where the historical temple was first built, where David prepared the place and Solomon built that first temple. So it has a lot of religious significance for Jews as the center of worship, as where God lives, as the place God wants to be worshipped and sacrificed to. This first section also gives us some biographical information about what we can call the historical Isaiah. If there was any person, any actual prophet named Isaiah, this first section tells the story of this person and who he was, what his relationships were. And sections follow, throughout these first 39 chapters we have oracles against all the nations, oracles against Judah and Jerusalem. It talks about the apocalyptic end of the earth with a few survivors and hints at this possibility of renewal. It has poems and prayers and also this hopeful consideration that the Davidic kingship could return and could bring God's blessing again, right? The kingship following the line of David. So that's first Isaiah. Second Isaiah has two sections. Remember, this is chapters 40 through 55. The first section is 40 through 48. This section speaks to Jacob and Israel and suggests that Babylon will fall and that Judah will return to the land. See, so clearly this is reflecting a new kind of consideration. Babylon now, not Assyria, not fear of the Assyrian captivity, but a period in which they're already in captivity in Babylon. Then the second section is chapters 49 through 55, the second half really, speaks to Zion and Jerusalem and talks about how the people should live with justice after Cyrus, the king of Persia, allows them to return. So they're still in captivity, but there's already hope at the second part for a return. Third Isaiah already is probably speaking to a time when the people have returned. And so it's a description of the glorious possibilities. Foreigners will come to worship God in the temple. This temple will be greater than the one Solomon originally built in Zion on the Temple Mount. There will be a new Zion. Jerusalem and Israel will be restored. Israelites will return from all corners of the world, right, including these lost tribes. The beauty and value of Jerusalem and Zion will be fully restored in God's eyes. And interspersed with it, it's not all positive. There are some Isaiah kind of condemnations of unjust dealing, of hypocritical religion, of evil foreign nations. And so, these are our major sections of Isaiah. Now, there are some critical issues here. Critical, again, meaning not critical as in we do not like them, but issues raised by critics to think about the source of these books, how they were composed, etc. So we have oversimplified these three sections. That's the first thing we can say. Three sections, three time periods, three writers. It's a complex book, but we just make it simpler. But actually, if you actually get into the detailed analysis, if you spend much more time studying Isaiah, you see that interspersed are different verses and sections that are mixed throughout. So, instead of thinking it so cleanly as, these chapters are all written only by first Isaiah, these only by second Isaiah, these only by third, in three different periods of time, we could think more generally about one core that's revised and added to at least two major times. And it can be hard to piece apart or cleanly analyze what was first, what was second, what was third, when these different parts reached their final form and what was there beforehand. Other critical issues are that we can use Isaiah to see the social and historical context of these three periods, right? First, Isaiah is really interested in a oppressive social system, it seems like, and the reliance on foreign powers and foreign gods. Second Isaiah is focusing that in exile, people are beginning to adjust to Babylonian religion and prosperity. They're doing well. They're not that interested in returning to the land of Palestine. They're not that interested in worshiping their God anymore. And then third Isaiah seems to be focused on a situation, and Jews have already returned to the land, but there's still some difficulties. There's still unjust rulers, hostile surrounding nations, the suffering of righteous people, right? There's a lot of problems still, but it's still holding out some hope of glorious restoration and trying to set things right before that time. Um, then we will talk about theology, right? Critical issues in theology and all of these kind of prophetic books. The three Isaiahs, we could say, all of them focus on some version of trusting in the Lord, right? And so Isaiah's theological legacy is quite complex, which reflects its authorship, which also seems quite complex. But one important legacy we could say is its huge effect on Christian theology. As I suggested, it has more citations in the Christian Bible in the New Testament than any other book in the Hebrew Bible. This is partly because of its very deep messianic ideas. I'm trying to tie this in with the line of David, and also with its discussions of a suffering servant, which seem to, for Christians, even justify or prophesy concerning Jesus' death. Um, that like the lamb being led off to slaughter, being cut off for the sins of his people. These kind of ideas all gain much resonance with Christian theology, and of course. The idea of the fact that even after the suffering, even after death, there would be a final glorious restoration in Isaiah is very fruitful for Christian reflection. So that's Isaiah. I mean, of course, there's a lot more. I want to emphasize again that these lectures are not meant to replace the text, but really just to supplement. There's a lot in the text that's there, and if you want to understand the evidence well, to write good essays, both reflection essays and kind of your midterm and your final essays, it would be good for you to really become familiar with these texts and the different evidences presented in them, as well as with the biblical texts themselves. You can reference what the author says about Isaiah with your own version of Isaiah, and see what they're talking about, the shifts in the different considerations in these sections. Okay, same with all these prophets. So the next book we'll get into is Jeremiah. And we actually know quite a bit about Jeremiah because it's recorded in the book, even though, again, as in all these cases, the actual composition is probably more complex than just one Jeremiah sitting down and writing. There are probably later editors, later writers. The content of the book is first a brief introduction, then oracles against Judah and Jerusalem, oracles against foreign nations, stories from Jeremiah's prophetic career, even more oracles against foreign nations, and finally, a historical appendix dealing with the end of Judah and the exile. One interesting point about Jeremiah is that the Greek and Hebrew texts are quite different. So the Dead Sea Scrolls actually side with the Greek, and the Greek version is somewhat cleaner, we could see, like in other versions like Ezekiel, with the condemnation of Judah, condemnation of nations, and then finally hope for restoration. Um, the the later Hebrew texts, the Masoretic texts, have the more interspersed situation that I just described earlier, the content where there's different kinds of interweaving of different themes. One major issue with either the Greek or the Hebrew text is the contrast between Jeremiah's oracles, which are pretty unrelenting and unsparing, proclaiming woe and doom for Judah, and then the prose sermons, in which he sounds like a Deuteronomist, and he's holding out hope that, well, if you repent and keep the covenant, you can still, there's still a second chance. So how do you square this, right? Is it just woe and doom, or is it like if you follow the covenant, you'll be okay, right? So there are various ways to categorize this to bring these conflict to resolve this conflict. One is that Jeremiah just accepts both ideas at the same time. He kind of can hold multiple contradictory ideas. Another one is that Jeremiah later converted to the Deuteronomic perspective. Or another perspective is that later revisions overturned the prophet's original ideas, right? That after Jeremiah spoke his oracles, other people wanted to come in and put their ideas in his mouth. Either way, we can say that the figure of Jeremiah was a priest, and he could have lived a comfortable life, but he chose to be a prophet instead. And that this choosing of being a prophet gave him a lot of opposition and difficulty throughout his life. He was persecuted and hounded. However, being a priest may also have helped him because he had some status. We know of other prophets during Jeremiah's time in his, in his writings, in these writings, that were murdered, and Jeremiah survives, right? In terms of theological vision, we can see that Jeremiah pushes in the direction of what we could call true or more advanced monotheism, where it's not just God is the greater, best God, Yahweh is better than Baal or Baal, but that only Yahweh exists, only God exists, only God created all things. All the other so-called gods will be brought to nothing, and that God uniquely chooses his people and will see through his covenant despite their failures. This kind of idea of monotheism where God is fully in control of all things. The Deuteronomic passages in Jeremiah, on the other hand, focus on heeding God's call and command, right? Doing your part, as we've seen, the Deuteronomist's concerns. And the theology of Jeremiah himself, we could say, is kind of questioning of God regarding his suffering and the suffering of his people, laying out his complaint, pursuing kind of divine justice with this ultimate faith, we could say, that God will make everything right in the end. The next book is Lamentations, which is just what it says in the title. It's a collection of laments. These laments are very carefully constructed. They are a total of 5 chapters. The first 4 are called acrostic. Now, acrostic is like when you write those poems, when you were a kid, maybe for Mother's Day, MOM, right? M stands for magnificent, O stands for outstanding, this kind of thing, where you follow alphabet, first letters of an alphabet to spell something out. Well, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and these 4 chapters have 22 verses, each of which begins with one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in alphabetical order, right? So it's like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way through Z, like for English, that would be the version, a poem like that. So you can see how carefully it's constructed. And then there's a 5th chapter, which also has 22 verses, but it's not acrostic. It just doesn't correspond with the alphabet. 3 of these poems lament the fate of Jerusalem. One is a individual lament poem. The last poem is a communal lament. There are other Near Eastern laments, and Jeremiah is held to be the author, but his Hebrew style is quite different in Lamentations. So many people question whether this was actually written by Jeremiah since it's such a different style. It focuses on the period of Babylonian conquest with Jerusalem devastated, but it's very beautifully composed as someone with significant training and literary talent could do, right? So maybe it's an elite or an intellectual class that's left in Jerusalem, and this is one of the members of that elite class, because someone seems to be writing from Jerusalem during this Babylonian conquest with a very high level of literacy. And its core theological question is this search for comfort and certainty in the face of great suffering and setback, right? In the aftermath of this devastation by the Babylonians of the kingdom of Judah, is there some assurance that God is unchanging in his mercy and his love? The next book is Ezekiel. Ezekiel is famous not only for his speech, but for his strange and symbolic actions that are supplementing his prophecies. And again, you have to read to see the details of these. I'm not going to cover them in detail. Like Jeremiah, Ezekiel is from a priestly family, although the priesthood seems much more important for Ezekiel than Jeremiah. Isaiah and Jeremiah are both prophesying in the land of Israel, while Ezekiel's doing so in exile in Babylon. His book covers his call to the prophecy, his oracles against Judah and Jerusalem, his oracles against the nations, right, the surrounding nations, and his prophecies of restoration, the plans for the restored temple and land. So, in terms of some major critical issues, we know that Ezekiel is a contemporary of Jeremiah, and like Jeremiah, he's advocating for submission to Babylon instead of resistance or rebellion. We also see that Ezekiel is very influenced by the Leviticus holiness code, this ideal of purity and holiness all the time, with no distinction between moral and ritual impurity. We pointed out that was kind of an exception within Leviticus, this very idealistic version of holiness. And then like Isaiah, Ezekiel seems to have an exalted view of the possibility of the David Zion kingship, while at the same time being able to harshly criticize the actual descendants of David, the kings of Judah during his time. And this criticism of kings can also be partly explained by the incredibly high, exalted view of the temple that we find in the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel. So that temple is so glorious and perfect that the need for kings seems to be diminished in that time, or seems to be this impossibly high standard by which kings can be criticized. In terms of theological themes, Ezekiel definitely emphasizes the importance of individual responsibility. So, like the Deuteronomic writers, there's retributive justice. If you sin, you will be punished. But unlike the Deuteronomic writers, it's not corporate punishment. It's not like the whole people will be punished for the sins of a few. People are punished only for their own sins, right, in Ezekiel. And with with Ezekiel, we also see more contrasts and continuities with the Deuteronomic writers, like maybe some wrestling with them or some acceptance of their ideas. Like Deuteronomy, he's de-emphasizing the importance of the kingship. But unlike Deuteronomy, he's not emphasizing the importance of the law to keep the covenant. He's seeing worship as more of an instinctual matter, something that seems obvious or that the human spirit already knows. Like these early 8th century prophets, it's not necessary to go to the law. You know what's right with God, and you can follow it. So another interesting point in Ezekiel is he has a lot to say about the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood. So it's hard to reference what is actually happening to the temple at his time historically, but there's a very important vision and weight given to the temple and the priests in Ezekiel. Then the last is, or not the last, but the next prophet is Daniel, and he's the last in the sense of possibly being the youngest book in the Hebrew Bible, the latest edition. It's the only one that's substantially written in Aramaic. Ezra has Aramaic too, but only when it's quoting kind of imperial Aramaic generally. So Daniel actually has Aramaic in its own text, and a good bit more, proportionally, I think, than any other book in the Hebrew Bible. As opposed to Hebrew, right? The rest of it is written in Hebrew. So, in Christian canons, Daniel is a book of prophecy, but its content is not any sort of prophecy like we've seen so far. So we've included it in the prophets, but it doesn't seem like these other prophets. It's really a book-length apocalypse, and it's the only kind of book-length apocalypse we have in the Old Testament, and it's combined with some courtly folk tales. So Daniel is really split kind of neatly in half. The first 6 books are these courtly folk tales, stories of Daniel and his friends, with the famous stories like being thrown into the furnace or delivered from the lion's den. The second 6 books are the record of Daniel's apocalyptic visions, with these visions of 4 beasts, or one like a human being, probably mirroring these important historical events like the conquest of Alexander, the conquest of the Persians, and the Seleucid ruler, especially Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the one of the emperors, sorry, in the Seleucid Empire that follows Alexander. The Seleucids are the descendants of one of Alexander's generals that has control of this area of Syria slash Israel today. And Antiochus Epiphanes is the most. We'll hear this. We've heard this name already. We'll hear it again. He's the most kind of notorious of these rulers. He's committing these noxious acts against Jewish religion, and the Jews are eventually going to rebel against him. So some critical issues in Daniel. The way the date and the authorship are listed clearly suggests that it's meant to be legendary, not historical. These are folk tales for learning, like Esther, not a historical record. There's also echoes of ancient Near Eastern myths, such as the beasts, the 4 beasts especially, and the one who comes with the clouds. Those all have Near Eastern kind of analogies or similar parallels. Daniel is also comprised with a combination of these folk tales in which the righteous prosper, and then there's an apocalypse in which we see in Daniel these folk tales that tell us that the righteous will always prosper. If you are righteous, don't worry, God will bless you, will save you from the furnace or from the lions. And then you also have an apocalypse that tells you that even if you don't see righteousness now, it's coming. It's in the future. The heavenly messenger knows behind the scenes God is truly righteous. So if we put these 2 ideas together, you can see this potential reference to Antiochus Epiphanes, which suggests that Daniel may have been writing to respond to a time when the Deuteronomy covenant seems to be broken. Why are the righteous suffering? There's an evil Gentile king, and they have to explain why, why they should keep believing in God, why they should continue to follow this covenant. And Daniel is asserting that God can be foreign and faithful lands, right? Look at all these good Jews, Daniel and his friends, who were in these foreign lands, and God took care of them. Don't be afraid. But also saying there's an apocalyptic timeline. We don't know exactly when, but we have to trust the heavenly will. We have to cooperate, maybe by revolution, right? And continue to obey God, continue to stay faithful to God. And in some way, behind the scenes, God will work it out. Daniel also has a theology. As we've seen, he's offering a view of justice that underlines this kind of question or challenge that's raised by the exile. to the Deuteronomist perspective. The Deuteronomist perspective is, if it's correct, it's like, why do the righteous and the innocent suffer along with the unrighteous? Ezekiel's emphasizing individual sin, individual punishment, right? Ecclesiastes kind of says there's no real answer. In Daniel, it's that God will do it in the future, that the apocalyptic timeline is still operating. In a way, this is also a theology of time. Daniel is arguing that time is in God's hands and that God is working on this huge cosmic scale. The reason we don't see justice is because we don't see the cosmic way that God thinks about time. It reaches far into the past and into the future, to where heaven and earth are moving through this veil. And so you have to peek beyond the veil, right? The definition of apocalypse is the removal of the veil. The veil in this understanding is what we see around us, what seems to see the real scene, to see how God is really working. We also see in Daniel that God's control over creation sometimes takes a pretty dark turn, because these apocalypses are often set up as kind of these ultimate battles between good and evil, or light and dark, happening behind the scenes or in the future, to be resolved. So this also means that some of creation, we could say, is just evil and is just dark and is meant to be condemned and destroyed by God, even though He's the creator of it, right? He's the creator of all these things. Still, some of these things just need to be wiped out, and that is part of this apocalyptic vision. The next book is Hosea, and now we're moving on to the so-called minor prophets, but Hosea is actually quite substantial in its length. It's split into three sections. The first section, Hosea is famously told to take a prostitute as a wife, and then to name his children in these highly symbolic names. One of his children's name is not pitied, the other one is not my people. And this is obviously meant to indicate God's judgment and Israel's betrayal of their marriage covenant. And then this first section is followed by two cycles of rebellion and restoration. So Hosea has these oracles condemning Israel for their trust in foreign powers and their trust in foreign gods, but then promising restoration. And the cycle repeats twice. Now, as far as critical issues, we have some hints from the 8th century, but some later also. It's mostly focused on the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, but there seem to be some southern influences from Judah as well. So we could, again, say complex and rolling, different authors, different writers over time. It interacts in interesting ways with other books of the Hebrew Bible, right? One of the fascinating things about Hosea is how early it is and how much it knows about the Hebrew Bible. It mentions Jacob, Moses, Israel wandering in the wilderness, and even hints of the covenant that Deuteronomy discusses. But because Hosea also mentions covenant in other ways, simply as a marriage contract or as a contract, it's possible that it's not so much following the Deuteronomistic perspective. It's not just following this Deuteronomy perspective, but that it's the other way around. Hosea is the first one to talk about covenants. He talks about it in general ways, but also in the specific way of, the Israel God covenant, and that Deuteronomy is inspired by Hosea, not the other way around. So Hosea sets the terms by thinking about marriage, covenant in terms of marriage, covenant in terms of the promise of restoration after a broken marriage, right? That these all inspired the Deuteronomists and their imagination. Okay. In terms of theology, Hosea kind of richly paints this picture that's very evocative, very emotional of God as this loving, patient spouse, and also as a parent, as a loving parent with a rebellious child. So you have tenderness mixed with shame, you have jealousy mixed with patience, but in the end, there's this promise that God will continue to love God's people faithfully, even though they are rebellious, or even traitorous as an unfaithful wife or a willful, rebellious child. Uh, Similarly, Hosea imagines that the appropriate theological response, for the people, for their part, is to return to faithfulness in God alone. Don't look to foreign powers, foreign alliances. Don't even look to any hypocritical rituals and sacrifices of priests, but just to return in love and faithfulness to God. Joel is the next of the prophets. Joel has three major sections. It describes an invading army as a plague of locusts. It has God's response to the people's repentance and pity, and then it talks about a coming cosmic day of the Lord. The critical issues are, one, it's not clear if this plague of locusts is describing an actual plague of locusts, or describing a drought, or describing an invading army, or describing a cosmic day of the Lord, right? All of this affects when and where we think the book is written, depending on whether we can find an invading army or a plague of locusts or a drought in history. More and more people believe, because there's no reference to a king or a regnal year, a year of reigning, that this was written in this post-exilic period when kings are no longer relevant, because the Persians are the only kings that matter. Judah has returned to the land, but no longer has a king. Theology, Joel is definitely moving in the apocalyptic direction, but this day of the Lord doesn't reach the level of later apocalypses. Nevertheless, still, you can see it's directed against the nation, so it has its own theological message, its own theological shift. The nations are not so much instruments of God's wrath, right? God is not using these foreigners to punish Israel. They're targets of God's wrath. God will judge them, will take down these foreign nations because of their abuses. And this can include the use of nature, right? The locusts. So the vision of God we get in Joel is this wrathful, powerful God with all creation under his sway, ready to deal harshly with the offending nations. The next book is Amos. Amos prophesied in the 8th century and is from the southern kingdom of Judah, but his prophetic career seems to be focused on the north. He speaks out against many nations, including Judah, but then he follows it with scathing critiques of Israel, the northern kingdom, for its social and religious failures, and he finally concludes with more oracles of doom against Israel and a hopeful vision of the future. So some critical issues are, one, because Amos seems so relentlessly critical, it's not clear what to do with when he's a little bit positive. Why is he yearning for the Davidic kingship? It's possible that these are later editors, maybe as late as the post-exilic period, trying to insert material that's useful to them, for their purposes. Amos also has some really sharp critiques. He describes in detail a feast of the elite, which is only made possible by their oppression and dispossession of the poor, right? He mocks their religious offerings, their so-called piety, arguing that God hates these kind of displays and will come with justice to avenge their oppressions and their supposed, shallow, superficial piety. In terms of theology, Amos is not arguing so much that all rituals and sacrifices are empty, but that if they are done properly, if you are truly sacrificing, if you're truly trying to honor God, it would lead you as a righteous person to regard the poor people also, to also care for the marginalized people who are in the land. Amos also warns about a day of the Lord, which is a day of wrath, like Joel, warning about the justice to come, warning the elites that their abuses will have consequences. The next book is Obadiah, which is the shortest book in the canon. It denounces Edom and then it vindicates Judah. Those are the two main sections. The anti-Edom material suggests the period of Babylonian exile when this kind of material was circulating. But even Obadiah, short as it is, might be composite with multiple authors and editors. So it may not just be simply from the Babylonian period. Its main theological point is God's protectiveness, that it will last past the division of the kingdoms and their exile, and God will surely restore them. Jonah is the next book, and it's not even really a prophetic book, as we've already seen some of these books that are called prophets under the Christian canon are probably not truly prophetic books, strictly speaking. Jonah, the main character, is a prophet, but it's more of a narrative, a novella with a prophet as a character than a prophetic book itself, right? Not really the words of a prophet so much as a short story with a prophet. This book can also be divided into two parts. The first part is the rejecting of the prophetic calling and its effects, that ends with the famous episode of being swallowed by a great fish. And then the second section is the return to preach, with Jonah's continued resistance to the message that he's preaching. The critical issues, we can see that the date seems to favor the post-exilic Persian period with influence from 2nd Isaiah and Jeremiah. Because of the topic, how Jews are supposed to relate to their non-Jewish neighbors. It's really only relevant in this post-exilic Judah. The whole book of Jonah is focused on how Jews should relate to non-Jews. And it's only really relevant once the Jews have returned to Judah, because many other non-Jews now live in that land. And so the question of association or disassociation is a very hot topic, right? How much should you have relationships with non-Jews who are near you? And Jonah seems to respond to and counter perspectives we find in books like Ezra and Nehemiah, which talk about being far apart from foreign women, putting away your foreign wives, not being close to foreigners, and separating from them completely. Jonah seems to offer a much more tolerant and accepting view of foreigners. As hinted by the subject of the book and the critical issues, the main point here in Jonah's theology is God's mercy. God will have mercy on all people, not just Jews, and that God's people shouldn't just be narrow isolationists who try to ignore God's love for the non-Jewish neighbor, but should also go to them and extend an offer of peace and live with them in peace and not be so small-minded. The next book is Micah. Micah is coming from the same period as Isaiah with the hatred of social injustice and idolatry that Isaiah also evokes. This would be first Isaiah. But as a rural person, Isaiah is from the city and knows the kings and such. But Micah has even fewer stakes involved in the status quo, even more marginal of a prophet. And so his condemnation, we could say, is more total than Isaiah's as well, but still includes some hopeful content. His structure includes threats against Samaria and Jerusalem, proclaiming Israel's restoration, and then these renewed oracles of doom, and then finally ending with God's favor again. Some critical issues are, because Micah has such unsparing language, perhaps the sections of consolation are from other writers. It's also not clear who and where Micah was. He's probably Judean from the south, but some of the additions may have been in Babylon, or maybe he remained in Judah after the exile. In terms of theology, Micah is deeply critical of oppressive landowners and nobles, many of them living in the cities. Because he's from the country, he can be taken as preferring the rural over the city. And even though Micah is very critical of injustice, possibly because of the later editions, these positive sections of Micah have a huge scope for talking about hope as well, in terms of both hope from the future Messiah of David's line. So it's kind of this the future-looking hope and also the past-looking hope, thinking back to the ancient promises to Abraham and Jacob and having hope because God will keep these promises. The next book is Nahum. It's a very short book. That's an interesting counterpoint to Jonah because it's triumphantly proclaiming the fall of Nineveh. It begins with a hymn to the divine warrior and then predicts Nineveh's doom before describing its destruction. So the critical issues are that it seems to be very obviously related to the fall of Nineveh, which we know happens in 613 BCE, but it could be before or after the event. It's not clear whether Nineveh has already fallen or is about to fall at that time. It criticizes only Nineveh, not Israel or Judah. So maybe it's a court prophet or an official prophet, to someone who's working with the king, right? Not criticizing Israel, not criticizing the Jewish people, but only the foreigners, helping the king criticize these foreign powers. In theology, it's pretty unique in envisioning a God whose faithfulness and love to Israel is mainly seen in terms of violent aggression against Israel's persecutors and enemies, symbolized by Nineveh. The next book is Habakkuk. Like Jeremiah, Habakkuk is sure that Babylon is God's way of punishing Judah, and Habakkuk also gives voice to people's complaints and promises that the righteous will live by faith in God's ultimate justice. So it offers this response to the people's complaints of their punishment. Don't worry, if you have faith in God's ultimate justice, you will live by that. That will cause you to live. And that is what it means to be truly righteous in this time of suffering and punishment. It has 3 sections. The first is a dialogue between God and the prophet. The second contains 5 woes against Babylon, and the last is a poem of hope for Judah. There is some debate over when it was created in terms of critical issues, but many now think it's in the early Babylonian period. And another critical issue is that there is one verse in Habakkuk that is extremely important to Christians like Paul, but it's quite difficult to translate. And that is the one I've already referenced or hinted at, that the righteous will live by faith. In its original translation, it possibly refers to the proud being the Babylonians being destroyed, but the righteous, the Jews, existing or living because of their faithfulness. Its theology is focused on this kind of idea of a balance, like a scale. God punishes Judah, but also favors them. And it's interesting because of its willingness, Habakkuk's willingness to directly challenge God, to fight against God, to lodge its claims against God, to try to get a divine answer, to get to the heart of God's idea of justice, where this balance lies. The next book is Zephaniah. It's another short book, and it develops the idea of the day of the Lord. It might date to the kingship of Josiah because it seems to reflect Deuteronomic ideas. There are a few sections in it. The first is the day of the Lord, then oracles against the nation, oracles against Jerusalem, and then finally oracles of salvation. In terms of critical issues, Zephaniah claims to be a descendant of Hezekiah the king, writing at the time of Josiah, who is another faithful king of Israel according to the Deuteronomic perspective. But scholars are not sure whether we should accept, that he's a descendant of Hezekiah or that he's really writing at the time of Josiah. There are some very interesting echoes of Amos in Zephaniah, which may hint that there's a master redactor. There's some sort of ultimate final editor that's editing all of these prophetic books and who's going through all the various prophets to adjust their message to fit their concerns. Because, why else would Amos and Zephaniah have these echoes? In terms of theology, we have something very similar to Habakkuk, that God is using the nations and also disciplining them to chastise Israel and eventually glorify Israel. Next book is Haggai, which is a small book that dates to the post-exilic Persian period, which shows that unlike the earlier prophets, some of these later prophets could support the temple cult and its administrators. We've seen some earlier prophets that are very critical of the temple. Haggai is very pro-temple. It's composed of 5 chronological dated sections of oracles, which include the people's responses. In terms of critical issues, we know that there's a delay in the rebuilding of the temple. Even though the Persian imperial policy was go and rebuild your temple, we see that for some reason there was a delay. Probably it's due to, in part, to opposition from other peoples that are already in the land. And it's also probably partly due to the fact that the Persians stopped paying such close attention because they had a lot of problems at home in the center of their empire. So they didn't have as much time to focus on their colonial policies at the margins of their empire. But eventually, when things got settled in the center of the empire, with the ruling succession and such, attention returned to all these colonies to see if they were doing what they were supposed to, if they were rebuilding their temples. So now there's some new urgency to rebuild this temple. Haggai seems to favor the Davidic restoration, a line of kings, which might sound dangerous when Persia is supposed to be the only king, but Haggai is very, very clear and careful to say that it has to be divinely initiated, and no human being should try to set up their own kings. God will set up the line of David when it's time. So, in terms of theology, Haggai connects the people's faithlessness with their economic and material suffering, and so seems to suggest this kind of Deuteronomic bargain, right? That God is in charge of retributive justice. If you do poorly, God will punish you, but if you do well, He will also be faithful and bless you. There's also this priestly theology, concern for holiness and priestly functions in this restoring of the temple. The next book is Zechariah, which is composed of at least 2 and possibly more works, all of which are focused on post-exilic Judah, the people after they've returned. Zechariah has a number of dated oracles, and then followed by 2 undated oracles, and these 2 undated oracles talk about the day of the Lord, right? So these kind of 2 major sections. And one of the big questions is, what is the relationship between these dated oracles, Zechariah 1 through 8, and these undated oracles, 9 through 14, Zechariah 9 through 14? The earlier section seems to be closer to Haggai, encouraging the people to rebuild the temple. The later section seems closer to the prophet Malachi, which is more disappointed in what's happening in the situation in post-exilic Judah among the returnees. Zechariah 1 through 8 also has some very confusing references as far as whether priests or kings are meant to rule. It could be that originally an heir of David was suggested as a king, but maybe it attracted too much attention from Persian authorities. Or maybe all along Zechariah wanted priests to be legitimate authorities along with the kings or in place of the kings. In terms of theology, Zechariah seems clearly to be aligned with the Deuteronomic perspective, that the power, Zechariah admires the power of God's retributive justice to punish evildoers. And there may be references to priestly sources. Like with Haggai, there's this focus again on the priests and the temple, so possibly drawing from these priestly sources. The next book is Malachi. This is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. It seems to be related to Haggai and Zechariah, but it's quite unsparing. It does not allow for almost any positive perspective on the temple and the priests and the sacrifices. So it has their critical edge, but not so much their positive one. It's divided into a few sections. The first condemns the priests and laity. The second warns of a coming day of judgment, and that ends with the promise of a forerunner, Elijah, coming to turn the hearts of the people. So in terms of critical issues, scholars have noticed that the beginning of Malachi seems similar to the start, kind of identical to the start of Zechariah 9 and Zechariah 12, and that the content is also similar. So it's possible that these were 3 separate books at one point, Zechariah 9, Zechariah 12, and Malachi, and that Malachi was split off at some point to make so that there would be 12 minor prophets instead of just a longer Zechariah. This is also helped by the fact that Malachi is a very generic name. It just means my prophet, my messenger. So Malachi seems to be criticizing the contemporary priesthood in favor of an ancient priesthood. That's his main perspective. And so he's focusing on the tribe of Levi and its descendants, this ancient priesthood, using ancient language In the contemporary day, they would be using terms like Zadok, but instead the descendants of the high priest. But instead, he's focusing on Levi, who is an ancient ancestor of Zadok and an ancient way of talking about the priests, possibly saying, all the priests these days, they're all corrupt. We want to go back to an older form of priesthood. In its theology, Malachi is blending Deuteronomic ideas of rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked with also priestly ideas on what a pure priest and a proper sacrifice should be before God. And his criticism of this dishonest worship, right? He's saying that these priests are substituting blind and lame um, uh, uh, animals, livestock from their own flocks for the pure and perfect sacrifices that should be, is actually kind of holding up an ideal that sacrifices a pure and honest form of communication, of communion between the divine and the human. That sacrifice should be something that's transparent and allows people and God to have direct transactions. Finally, this last section is on the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha. So we call them Apocrypha or Deuterocanonical, meaning a secondary canon, because they don't belong in all canons. They're not in all the canons. They are in, most of these books are in, the Roman Catholic Bible and also some Orthodox versions of the Bible, but they are not in Protestant and Jewish Bibles. So just running through them quickly, we have books like Tobit, which is a Jewish novella about life under Assyrian exile. Judith, about a woman who defeats the Assyrian army. First Maccabees, which is the story of the early period of the Maccabean revolt. Second Maccabees, focused on a later period of the Maccabean revolt with special attention to the Jerusalem temple. Fifth, Wisdom of Solomon, probably from the Egyptian diaspora, which defends the Jewish faith versus other philosophies or religious options. Sixth, we have a book either called Ecclesiasticus or called The Wisdom of Ben Sira, which is a collection of proverbs encouraging people to live in a wise way as guided by the Torah. Seventh is a book called Baruch, supposedly written by Jeremiah's scribe. This is a character that's mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, and this book focuses on the confession of sins and restoration. And then the eighth book, it's not really one book here, but we're putting a bunch of miscellaneous things in this eighth section, which are additions to Esther and Daniel. In terms of Esther, there is an attempt to make Esther more explicitly religious because in one version of Esther that we have, the name of God is not mentioned at all. So some people have added more to Esther to make it more explicitly religious. In terms of Daniel, just adding more stories to Daniel, more folkloric tales and events. There are more than that, besides these books that are deuterocanonical and included in some of these Christian canons. There are even more Jewish texts from this, what we could call the biblical period, during which the Old and New Testaments are being written. And many of them share a lot of the same characteristics with books that are included in the biblical canon, right? Books like Esther and like Daniel. And so two books, we'll focus on two of these books that are very important to a group called the Essenes who are living in Qumran. The first book is the Jubilees, which is a retelling of the whole biblical story from creation to the Exodus, and it's showing some of the origins of the Mosaic Law in the ancestral period. So trying to give a new understanding of the importance of the Mosaic Law that goes all the way back to Genesis. The second book is called First Enoch. That's also very popular then, which is actually an apocalyptic collection of 5 booklets talking about the heavenly secrets of the past, the present, and the future, and especially focusing on the fate of God's chosen and righteous ones. All of these pseudepigrapha, so pseudepigrapha means written under another name, but as we've seen, a lot of the books that are actually in the Hebrew Bible are also probably pseudepigrapha, written or at least edited under a name that's not actually theirs. But we can combine that along with books, writers and such as Philo and Josephus, all Jewish writers and thinkers, to flesh out how early Jews were living, believing, behaving, worshiping, sacrificing around the time before the founding of Christianity, really in this period. And so, the fact that we even have an Apocrypha begs the question of a canon, right? Why do we have a canon? Why are some books canonical? Why are they deuterocanonical or non-canonical, like Jubilees and First Enoch, when there's some very clear similarities between what's in the canon, what's in the secondary canon, what's not even in the canon? This is, kind of a short discussion, but it's not short because it's simple. It's short because it's complicated in a way, ironically. The New Testament section is much longer, but that's because there's actually more evidence for the New Testament that we can talk about. With the Old Testament, the arguments are much greater because there's less actual evidence. So all kinds of theories are still possible, still within the realm of possibility. And because so many of them are possible, it's much harder to talk about. We can only just make some very, very general remarks, and just know that there's a huge literature that's debating the details of these remarks. This collection is bigger than the New Testament. It's written over a much longer period of time than the New Testament, and there is less evidence, right? So that gives you this idea of like the amount of theories that could be out there in terms of authorship and canon and its inclusion. So if we're thinking about canon, the first thing we should say is that in the Hebrew Bible itself, in these books we've already read, we can see that there's evidence that the Torah is becoming a kind of set scripture, a set list, an authoritative list. If a canon is an authoritative list that's important for a community, this kind of scripturalization, canonization is happening already very early. Many of the prophets are very indebted to um, the Pentateuch, to the Torah. And in Ezra and Nehemiah, it explicitly talks about the reading and the teaching of the Torah. So already there is something called the Torah that's set in their minds. And we've seen the influence of Deuteronomists, Yahwists, priestly influences throughout these kind of prophetic works. So many scholars believe that the Torah a canon is set by the 5th century BCE, and certainly by the 4th or 3rd century BCE. Now, in terms of the other books of the Hebrew Bible, right? The Torah is only the Pentateuch, these 5 books. What about all the prophets and the writings? They don't seem to become canonical until a lot later, and it may be helpful to think of them instead of, being, on the same level as the Torah in some ways, as being supplementary literature, helpful literature that supports, explains, and covers, the Torah, or interprets. So if you want to think about the earliest division, some of the earliest divisions we have of this, the Hebrew Bible is often called the Tanakh in Hebrew itself. It's the TNK, we could call it. The T is for the Torah, the N is for the Naviim, the prophets, and the K is for the Ketuvim, the writings, right? So it's like a 3-part structure. The Hebrew Bible is understood to be divided into Torah, prophets, writings, or teaching, prophets, writings, law, prophets, writings. The first time we see this kind of 3-part structure is in the book Wisdom of Ben Sura, actually, that we covered in this section. It's written about 130 BCE, and there's a little section that talks about the law, the prophets, and the others that follow, right? So these 3. And then if we want to think about late, as early as 130 BCE, we may have law, prophets, and writings already, this Tanakh. As late as the 7th century CE, right, we see in the Talmud that the rabbis are still trying to set this list. So there's still some struggle, some contest over what is the proper list. So we have a huge range of, over 800 years possibly, in which this canonization is happening. So a lot of it depends on how you define canon, right? If you want to think about an early canon, it's probably something more fluid or flexible. What Ben Sura is talking about is probably something very flexible. What counts as law, prophets, and others that followed? Probably many people could be there. If you're thinking about the rabbis as the 7th century CE, right, hundreds of years after Jesus, and the New Testament canon is already set, it could be because we're thinking about a very fixed set of books, which is indeed what they're talking about. They're listing the books, book by book by then. So depending on how you define canon, fluid and flexible, or set and fixed, then it's, earlier or later. But in any case, however we think about the canon, you can kind of see that there's a kind of flexibility built into it, even though we like to often think of canons as these closed lists that no one can touch and are set in stone and have been for many, many years. People are always adding even to the most fixed of canons, we could say, especially living religious communities. There's always new interpretations, new negotiations, new emphases, right, that create variations in the canon, different ways to think about the canon. And that's a really nice segue, actually, for the end of the Hebrew Bible and the start of the New Testament, because this is exactly what happens when a group of Jews begin to think that the coming of Jesus is the most significant intervention in this Jewish canon, in this Hebrew canon, and begin to write and collect the texts that we know as the New Testament.